Okay, so first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I love the questions too. Good questions.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I wanted to do here was really get to the heart of the matter in terms of how these pieces were actually put together, because I've read quite a lot about Trout Mask Replica, and it strikes me that very often what you actually read are descriptions of what reviewers think of the record, in terms of what it sounds like to them and what their impression is of it. But that doesn't always help you a great deal in terms of understanding how the pieces are actually put together and what the process of learning the music was. So that's something that I think is actually quite poorly understood. And I have to say your book was extremely interesting to read because it clarified quite a lot of these questions for me. And the other thing I wanted to do, just starting off, was to say that I think the scope of your activities is amazing. I mean, obviously you're an extremely well known drummer, but you're also a dancer and a writer and an
I used to be a
actor.
dancer.
Yeah, well, and a singer and an arranger and a composer, and I mean, it's actually quite astounding the career that you've had. With that in mind, what are you doing these days?
Well, the pay isn't that good. That's the whole thing about it.
Right.
What am I doing these days? I'm getting ready to do a farewell tour in November because the Magic Band has no original members except me now, and I just feel like it's time. It's time to put that to rest. I may do something else. I may perform, but if I'm going to perform with people who aren't Magic Band members, I think I'd rather do it under another name. You know.
Yeah.
So I'm putting that together. That's not going to be any big deal. It's just going to be another tour, basically. But I'm also going to play in Austin with a group that I've never worked with before. I was introduced online to them, and I talked to one of the guys on the phone. And the name of the group is Churchwood. And I think what I'm going to do is just pick simple material rather than trying to get into too many complex things.
Uh-huh.
Did he what? Did he grow fins? That kind of stuff. And just have a good time. But they're actually going to bring in some backup singers and maybe a horn section. So I get to do a little arranging for that. So I'm hoping to make it a very accessible thing. Not so much about the weirdness of Beefheart, but about the good times and party music stuff because he did do some of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it that way, and I'm thinking, if I do something more accessible like that, maybe it'll open a doorway so I can tour in the South because I've never been able to tour in the States
You mean as a solo artist or
with the Magic Band.
with the Magic Band?
Yeah, I've never been able to get a tour in the U.S. So it's a little strange because we're an American group, but we have to go to the UK primarily to actually tour. So we have had pretty good response in Europe. I was really surprised because they booked us in Berlin at an 1,100 seat place and or 1,100 capacity room, and it was on a Sunday night. And I'm thinking, well, we usually play to 400 to 600. This isn't like you know the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
we play to 400 to 600 people in a venue usually. I mean, much lower than that is often actually, but average 400 to 600. But on a Sunday night, I think we had 800 or 900 people in Berlin. And I was surprised that there was that big a following in Germany. And that does, I'm sure that's probably laughable to somebody who does, more mainstream music. But for this group, that was a good show, and I was very encouraged by that. We also did well in Switzerland, and I'd love to play Amsterdam again. I'm hoping to get one last shot at playing the Paradiso in Amsterdam. So I'm working on that. I'm also, you mentioned this Patreon. So I went on there and I see, okay, I've got to give people something in order to receive this funding. So I'm going to try to set up a series of drum clinics where I teach how I wrote the parts to Hair Pie, Steal Softly Through Snow, the ones that I actually wrote parts to,
Uh-huh.
and uh, and then I'll go on from there. But a lot of the songs, because of the fact that I was the drummer in the band, but I was also the organizer and the guy who is transcribing all the music and playing it for the other guys and replaying it for them when they forgot it the first time. Um, I didn't get a lot of time really on the drums to practice my parts. We'll talk about that later on, but that's what I'm up to right now is setting up a little video feed from a laptop so that I can do sort of a demo of what I'd like to do in
Okay.
terms of that. And then if I can raise enough funds, I'll buy a nice camera, you know, high def, so you can really tell how old I am.
Well, I mean, Patreon is actually an amazing thing, and it's extremely recent, but it seems like it could be a viable way for artists to have a sort of regular income, especially artists who are doing things that are a little bit off the beaten track.
Right?
And all of these things are just a few years old at this point, and I think they're going to have a profound change in the way art is made in the future. Because when the Beefheart stuff was done, you guys were working with record labels that obviously were not always extremely honest, and to put it
Well,
mildly.
yeah, well, Buddha wasn't that honest, but actually Warner Brothers was great.
Yeah.
I think more in that term, it was Don who wasn't the honest one.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
But go ahead, you were.
Well, it's a way basically of allowing artists to create their work essentially on their own terms, and then as long as they're skilled at getting other people interested in what they're doing, then there's a remarkable way forward. So you can have just enough people who are willing to send $10 or $20 a month or something, and if you can get a few hundred people doing that, then you've got an income. So I think that's
Yeah,
pretty amazing.
I'm going to try that because I would like to continue with the art, and I would like. I'm kind of getting to the point where I don't like to tour anymore. I guess I'm turning into a grouchy old curmudgeon. I don't know. But just the whole thing about going to the airport and being squeezed into Richard Branson's tiny little sardine seats, just doesn't appeal to me anymore. Although I really do enjoy meeting people and I enjoy the performing, but everything leading up to the performing and everything afterwards is just so difficult to deal with. So I'd kind of like to do more recording and less touring.
Well, as I was reading your book, the section that deals with the 1975 tour, which you've said was one of the high points of your career with Beefheart in terms of
Yeah.
your relationship with him. But I was astounded by just the insane schedule. I mean, reading it in detail, I can't understand physically how it's possible to get through something like that. Just week after week after week of playing in a different city, every night basically, and um, it must be extremely grueling. I mean, how do you get through something like that?
Well, at the time, I was in very good shape. I think, what was I? I was 27. I was in prime shape because I'd been dancing, and the only problem that I had was smoking. I wasn't much of a drinker ever. I'd have a beer now and then, but it just never appealed to me to slur my words and look like a complete ass. So uh, I couldn't figure out. I couldn't quite get the attraction.
Right.
But I think part of it was a lot of the stuff was taken care of for us on that tour. Most of the time we had roadies that set up our stuff, so we didn't have to set up and tear down.
Right.
So we had a lot of time to rest. And we had, I think, 5 days. We had spent 4 or 5 days in Lyon, France, in a hotel outside of town, which that was the most boring thing I've ever done in my life. You're watching television and The Untouchables are on in French.
Right.
The hell? So it was an interesting. But for me, it was because I stayed in good shape.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other guys would kind of, they would fall out. I did get sick once in Glasgow, but the other guys kind of, they'd be really tired, but they were drinking all the time. And that just, it takes your energy away.
Well, I had actually a few questions dealing with Trout Mask Replica, which I recently did an analysis video on regarding Frownland.
Right.
So I was wondering if I could just sort of ask you a few questions about that and
sure,
and
yeah.
get your point of view about some of these things. Because
have at it.
Okay, well, let's do it. So the first question is sort of a grand tour style question, and one of the things that really struck me reading your book, again, was you seem to have stuck with Don for longer than any other musician that worked with him, right, from Safe as Milk up to Dock at the Radar Station, with some interruptions in between, obviously. But I was struck by the fact that clearly he was someone who was extraordinarily difficult to work with for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
And yet there's this sort of fascination, there's a kind of pull that kept you going back. So some of the other guys, got fed up, which is completely understandable, and left, but you kept returning. And there's a kind of interesting phenomenon that you describe in the book where you would go back and you would sort of regret it, but you would do it anyway. And there's one point in the book where you say that you decided to go back. I think it was maybe during Lick My Decals Off, and you described it as being possibly the stupidest decision you ever made. So, which I was quite surprised to read, given how remarkable that album is. Given what a defining statement it is. How can you regret having participated in it? I mean, is that really how you feel in hindsight about it?
Well, it was because of the difficulty of working with Don. He had just gotten his picture on the cover of the Rolling Stone. And before that, Don already had a tremendous ego. And after his picture was on the Rolling Stone, it inflated even more. So when I first came back, he said, no, none of that stuff that happened before is going to happen. And if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
All the talks and, the violence and all that. And then it just slowly worked its way back to that. I remember just as I had quit school, I was staying with Art Tripp because he had an extra room at his house. So I just stayed with him. And Don came over after some meeting. I think we had just signed contracts or something. And he said, and he had a meeting with the whole band, and Jan was sitting next to him. And he said, you realize it here that I'm doing you guys a big favor because it's me they're coming to see, not you guys. It's me that they want to see. I'm the one who makes this happen. And right at that point, I just thought, why did I do this?
Yeah.
Because, no way to have any kind of team spirit or effort. And I'd seen these guys, just Mark and Bill especially were just so dedicated to Don. Mm-hmm. And yet I remember one day Don said, Don called Mark and said, my toilet's stopped up, and Mark came over to fix it for him. And he had a bathroom plunger, and Don didn't like the way he was holding the bathroom plunger and grabbed it out of his hand and stuck it on his face and pushed him up against the wall.
Oh my God.
That's, that, and there was such a lack of respect for these guys who, you listen to Peon, those guys worked on that and worked on it and worked on it, and they were like one entity playing that piece. You don't get that kind of dedication from musicians. You just don't. And for those guys, and for their level of ability, those guys really gave their all to everything, So it was sad for me to see that kind of stuff happening. And I asked Don why he did that, and he says, I didn't like the way he was holding it.
My God.
And that's just one of, hundreds of examples of that kind of behavior. So, yeah, I regretted going back after that. But at the same time, when I first went back, I thought, well, he's gotten recognition here, even though I didn't get any recognition. I wasn't even mentioned in the article, the Rolling Stone article. Well, one place they said, well, who's the guy you got playing on drums now? And he says, Drumbo 1. I says, well, wasn't there another Drumbo? And he said, yeah, but he was Drumbo 2. And he says, well, who comes after Drumbo 1? And he said, Erasure. But, actually, Don replaced me with a non-drummer. The guy didn't even know how to play. And just thought, he thought so little of my playing that he thought that anybody could just do that stuff, I guess.
Right.
So, but I came back thinking, well, he's got his picture on the cover of the Rolling Stone. Maybe I can gain some recognition here and move on from there and do some other things. But it just didn't happen that way.
But it was a repeating pattern that went on for basically the entire time you worked with him. So what do you attribute the longevity of your working relationship with him to?
The next time I worked with him was in 1975, and I went in with the idea of doing a couple of big shows that he was doing. He was doing Nebworth, and then he did a big show pretty high-paying show at the Roxy.
Yeah.
And I needed money. I couldn't get a gig with bands. Bands thought it was horrible because I didn't play regular drums. I couldn't play 2 and 4 all night. I'd go crazy and put in something different or try a different experiment. And years later, these guys came up to me and said, I didn't realize you're a famous drummer. I thought you were a horrible drummer, but you were just playing over my head. So it was, I couldn't make any money up here doing that. And I'd had a job. I'd actually gotten a job delivering furniture for a company. And the guy that they paired me with couldn't get along with anybody, and the last guy he worked with, he got in a fist fight with. So this guy, for about 2 weeks, he was really nice to me, and then he started in, and one day he threw a dining room table at me. And I just said, I walked up to the front and I said, when somebody starts throwing furniture at me, it's time for me to go.
Right.
And it was right around that time that Don said, or Herb Cohen called me and said, we've got this thing at Nebworth and then a couple of things at the Roxy and a Chicago TV show. And I said, sure, I'll do it, So I was sleeping in my parents' garage. That's how poor I was. And I remember there was a little room in there, a little room next to the actual garage. And I'm sleeping in there, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and Don was standing in my room staring at me. And I said, what the hell? And he goes, you should do it, man. And I said, I already told Herb I will do it. Now go home. Showed him out. Then he went home. But, then I did I left because it, after a while it just got to be the same kind of thing. I left after Bat Chain Puller was done in 1976. I came back for a short stint in 1977 when he pissed off his drummer and the drummer quit just before a tour. And Gary J. And I stayed just a little while in 1977, and then I came back in 1980. But that was a whole spiritual reason why I did that, and I'm not going to go into that.
Right, you described that in the book, actually.
Yeah, but that wasn't even really me. It was just sort of something. And, at the end of that, when I said goodbye, it was closure. I knew I had done everything I could possibly do. But there was a part of me that always felt sorry for Don. And I think he sort of portrayed that. He used that with people. He was so helpless, Oh, I really need help here.
Yeah, yeah.
And I felt for that a lot. but part of it is that I just saw that he had this incredible ability musically, and I enjoyed the music. So, in order to do the music, you had to put up with the guy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
I mean, you must have had a really intense identification with the music, that goes just beyond what might normally happen in that kind of situation. I mean, it was as though you were born to play it in a sense. I mean, your style seems to have worked absolutely perfectly with what he was trying to do, and you were amenable to experimenting as well, which not a lot of musicians are. So,
yeah, that was here. That's the thing. I mean, I have never been able to play in another group. You know, it's just it doesn't work. I can't go in and play Freebird at a bar. What am I going to do? I mean, I would have loved to have gotten with the right people, but there never were the right people.
you did an extremely compelling cover version of Surfin' USA. That
Yeah, well, that wasn't really a band. That was just some fun.
yeah,
We were just having some fun in the studio.
yeah.
Henry suggested that I make it, more negative as we go along, but I wanted to do it straight because I thought it sounded great.
So one of the things I wanted to do, with your agreement, was
Sure.
just describe a little bit the way that Trout Mask Replica came together, because it's amazing how many times you can tell people the way it was put together. You still keep hearing the same inaccuracies about that record, and a lot of people still seem to have the mistaken perception that it's actually chaotically put together, and it's not at all. I mean, it sounds as though
No.
it was the product of months and months of extremely hard work, under
Yeah.
torturous circumstances. So I was wondering if you could walk us through a typical day at the Trout Mask house in Woodland Hills.
Was there such a thing? Yeah, I can. There's usually, we stayed up late. Usually, uh, if we weren't working on music, Don had this thing about having his girlfriend read to us. Uh, so we'd all go in and she'd read to us after dinner.
Yeah.
And usually, I mean, one book was Diary of a Genius
Salvador
by
Dali.
Salvador Dali, yeah.
Yeah.
And another one was The Naked Ape. I hated that book because, they had all these physical, like all this body language stuff, and Don started interpreting everybody's body language, and it was like, oh my God, as if we aren't enough in a goldfish bowl.
Right.
We got this going on. So Desmond Morris was the author of that. But the morning would usually start out, we'd get up late. I mean, we'd probably go to bed at midnight to 1 in the morning, maybe get up 9, 10, somewhere around in there. And there was no set schedule or alarm clock. We all slept in the living room except Don and his girlfriend. They had the bedroom. And I slept in a mattress that was up against the wall, sort of folded up against the wall. And that was I couldn't sleep on the floor. The other guy slept on the floor in sleeping bags. And I couldn't do that. And, but anyway, we'd get up and there was nothing to eat usually. Maybe a piece of toast or something. There was hardly any food in the house. And I would generally, during one period of time, I put my drums in a little laundry shed that was outside because, the guitarists, they could practice anytime they wanted to. They can go in another room in the house or downstairs in the corner or whatever. But, when you're playing drums, everybody around you knows it.
Right. Right.
So I'd go out in the laundry shed to at least give the guys some break from my drumming. And that's how I developed the cardboard that went on the drums. I put cardboard on everything in order to, so I could at least practice the movements, even though it really screwed with my rebound and my stick control because, there's no rebound.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I developed a weird style of playing technique from that. Um, but anyway, usually we'd figure out Don would be up 12 to 1 in the afternoon, somewhere around in there. And usually you could assess the way the day was going to go by that first half an hour he was up.
Hmm.
Whatever mood he was in. Um, Sometimes I'd be sitting at the piano. I remember one day sitting at the piano teaching uh, Rockette, one of the bass lines. I would play it and he'd play it. And he'd say, "What note is that?" And I'd play it. And he said, "How did the rhythm go?" And I remember Don coming out and Mark's really trying to get. It was a tough part. It was a tough part to play. He was finger picking the bass. This isn't like playing a Rolling Stones song.
Right.
I mean, one of those songs was equal to doing a Rolling Stones album.
Right. Right.
If
Right.
you really want to get down to it, as far as the amount of time and the complicated mess that it was. But anyway, I remember one day Don came out and Mark is like squinting and he's trying to get this part. And he's trying to play it, and Don's looking at him. He's looking at me and shaking his head like pathetic, sort of. And Mark stops and he says, "Why don't you just fucking play it, man? Just play it, you know?" And Mark's saying, "Well, I'm trying to." He says, "I don't think so. I don't think so. What is your problem, man?" And then it would go into all day us talking to Mark about what his problem was, and or it could be all day working on music, and maybe Don. A lot of times Don went out at night. He would just leave and leave us there, and we'd work on music, and that's when we actually got the most done, when he was out of the room.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of time wasted.
Oh, we could have done that album in half the time, really. I mean, at the amount of, we were putting in 12 hours a day on music, 10 to 12 hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
average. I remember when I was learning the drum parts at the last minute, I had some 14-hour days there.
So how did you put those drum parts together? Did you write them out at any point, or you had the music essentially memorized? You were referring to the charts. How did that work?
Yeah, the good thing is that I was so familiar with the music that gave me an advantage in that respect, because I knew how long each section was and so on. But yeah, I did. I wrote out. I didn't write out drum parts to every piece because there just wasn't time. But I think the first one that I wrote out was for Hair Pie, and it took me almost a day to learn it. I thought, well, I better start writing them simpler than this. But it was a combination of 3 rhythms going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that each part, the more I wrote and the more I tried doing them, the easier it became to assimilate them. In plain words, the learning curve to learning became faster.
Right.
So, so I would say that one of the songs that's probably 100% mine, except for one little thing that Don took out, is Hair Pie. That's why I like doing that particular piece.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about the record that I think is incredibly innovative, but that isn't often commented upon, is the fact that you have 2 guitar parts that are essentially equal. Like there's no lead guitar, rhythm guitar division on this album. The two are equivalent, and in addition to that, you have a bass guitar that, in a lot of the songs, doesn't actually fill the role of grounding the harmony at all, right? So it's playing basically a third independent part. So basically, you have these 3 melodic instruments, all on the same plane, and all playing equally complex material all the time, which means that a typical song on Trout Mask has 10 times the amount of information that a typical rock song has easily.
Oh yeah.
So, but even compared to Strictly Personal or Safe as Milk, I mean, there's an enormous leap from those albums to Trout Mask in terms of the way the pieces were actually put together. So even on Strictly Personal, the bass, I love the bass playing on that album.
Yeah.
Jerry Hanley's an amazing bassist, but Yeah,
Well, are you talking about Strictly Personal now?
yeah,
Okay, yeah, go.
yeah. That he's essentially doing what you would expect a really good bass guitarist to do. The bass is grounding the harmony on those
Right,
pieces, right? So
right.
whereas on Trout Mask you have chords, you have really complex rhythmic figures being played on the bass. Um,
Hmm.
so so that in addition to the idea of having these two completely independent guitar parts, really gives the album a wildly different feel. And I'm just curious as to how that arose. How did you guys make the leap from doing Strictly Personal, which is obviously an extremely experimental album, but nevertheless,
Right.
it has what you could call fairly straightforward rock instrumentation.
Yeah,
To
and
Trout Mask
accessibility.
and accessibility, right? To Trout
Right.
Mask, where you have multiple streams of music going on simultaneously, and sometimes in unrelated key signatures and time signatures and so on. So how did that transition take place exactly? Was there a transition period, or was it just abrupt?
Um, Frank Zappa had a lot to do with that because we went over to see Frank. He invited the whole band over one day, and the basis of it was just to socialize with us, say hi, how are you. But he did have a little spiel. He
Yeah.
came down the stairs, shook everybody's hand like a businessman, and it was very cordial with us. I don't know, he gave us coffee or something. And then he sat down next to his record player and he said, people say you need to go to college to get uh, a musical education. But he said, all you really need is a record player.
Hmm.
And then he put on Procol Harum, A Whiter Shade of Pale. And he loved that song.
Hmm.
And he loved the chord changes, the way it worked. So he just played that for us. And I was very impressed by the fact that he would acknowledge the greatness of another band, because Don would never do that. Don was always putting people down unless it was another genre of music
Right.
entirely. But Don was more like threatened by things, whereas Frank seemed to embrace other bands. Um, so anyway, as we were leaving, Frank said, "Hey, look, I got to go to work now," and Ian Underwood showed up. I always want to say Anderson. Ian Underwood showed up, and we all met him. And he said, "Okay," Frank said, "I got to get to work, so you guys need to go." As we were walking out, Frank had this music sitting up on the piano, and he said, "Okay, can you play this?" And Ian played it, played a little bit of it, and he says, "Well, this is wrong right here. So this is unplayable, or this doesn't make sense harmonically, or whatever." So they were talking stuff out. And I noticed Don had this intense look on his face. He was watching really closely, sort of, in the corner. So, and I could see the wheels working, like he was thinking about something. Well, he went right out and got a piano. And that was the big change. The
Uh-huh.
abrupt change was the piano.
Okay.
It was like in 2001 where the ape touches the big, oh, ah. So, so when he got the piano, um, Don had this idea that he was just going to record on tape endlessly,
Right.
and I put a stop to that because I was the guy that always wound up trying to find some empty tape because he would never buy new tape. So I just said, I took the fuse out and I said, "It's broken. It won't work. I don't know what's the matter with it."
Hmm.
And he was playing away, and I had been writing drum rhythms out, and I just picked up my little pad and manuscript paper and penciled out what he was playing. Now, I didn't even know that there was a bass clef.
Hmm.
So both the upper and the lower were both treble clef. And I had to go every good boy does fine to figure out all cows eat grass, because I'd only done rhythms. But I wrote it out, something, and I just set it down on the piano casually. I wasn't thinking about anything. Wasn't, I just thought, I wonder if I can do that, and I did it. So he came down later with the paper. He had these big eyes. He's going, "Can you play this?" And I said, "I think so." And he said, "Try." So I went back and sat at the piano for a minute, and I messed around, and then I played the thing, because basically all this stuff was one position. He put his hands in one position and he'd do a rhythm. He didn't move around a lot at that point. So he's like this, he says, "That's how we're going to do this album." We already knew it was going to be a double album, and I'm thinking, man, that's going to be a lot of work.
Well, that was going to be my next question, was what was the point at which it was clear that this would be a double album? I mean, was it...
From the beginning.
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
Did the release of Freak Out have something to do with that, do you think? Freak Out being a double album.
I wouldn't know. I wasn't privy to those conversations, those private conversations. I just remember the first time that Don called Frank. And Frank had just come back from his long gig at the Garrick Theater, and we had just been screwed over with that Strictly Personal. It was a bad mix. Don was really unhappy with it, and he says, "I'm going to call Frank." And the first thing he did was he brought home "We're Only in It for the Money."
Uh-huh.
And we listened to it, and I was lying on the floor laughing so hard. I was just laughing all the way through it, But then that night, he said, "John, come with me." So I got in the car. We hopped in the car and went down, and he was on the phone. I'm standing outside watching it, and I'm looking at his body language and the expression on his face. So I'm saying, man, these guys, are catching up on old times. They're having a great time with this conversation. And he got off the phone, and he came out and he says, "We're going to do an album with Frank, man. He's going to give me creative freedom," which was a big deal with Don.
Right.
He was always using that term, creative freedom. And I said, "Great," So that's kind of the way it all got started. But it was going to be a double album right from the beginning.
Okay, so you must have had an inkling of what you were in for then, at least on that level.
Not really. This was before I got the piano, so.
Right.
Most of what happened with Don is he'd sit around with the guys and whistle parts to them, and Alex and Jeff and Jerry would mostly be sitting through one little amp, sitting on the floor in the living room playing quietly, and I'd be keeping time tapping on a snare drum that I had stuffed with rags so it wouldn't disturb the neighbors. That's how we worked a lot.
I had another question relating to that, which was, so you've described the dimensions of the project, the fact that it was clear from the outset that it would be a double album, and that there would be this radical new way of putting the material together. One thing that's extremely hard for me to grasp, and I've talked with a number of composers about this too, and we're all actually quite, we're seeking clarification about this point, which is that given the extraordinary complexity of the music, given the incredible ambition of this project, I mean, you guys didn't have formal music training. Correct me if I'm wrong, but so how did you remember all of this material? I mean, it's an 80-minute long record of of incredible density. So how did you do that?
It just goes to show what you can do if you're motivated enough. We all let's see. Mark didn't have training. I had a couple of years of marching band, which isn't boom, boom, boom,
Right.
Bill had taken a little bit of theory, so he was actually a little more advanced in that respect. And Bill had an interesting way. Everybody has a different way of learning parts. Like, for instance, Bill, he'd say, he wanted everything vertically. He'd say, "What's the first note or chord?" So I'd play him that and go, dink, okay, what's the next one? And I'd play the next if it was a chord or whatever. and he'd say, okay, now just tap out the rhythm for me. So I'd go ta 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 or something, you know. That was a pretty standard rhythm, by the way.
Uh-huh.
Don liked that boom, boom. You know, he was always using it, boom, boom, followed by whatever.
Right.
Or ba ba ba. He loved that one too. But anyway, that's the way Bill learned. And you know, at first I was just scratching all this stuff down. It didn't have titles. You know, what are you going to call this thing? You know, so I'd write something that reminded me of the day, so that I go, okay, this happened on the day that, you know, we had spaghetti or something.
Right.
Oh, we never had spaghetti though. Wait a minute. This is the day we got starved even more. Burn soybean.
Right.
But anyway, I'd write something down, and Don would get mad and say, "What the hell is that?" You know, and I'd say, "That's the only way I can remember, because you're not giving me any titles here. I've got to have some way to remember this stuff."
So, but at that stage, did he have a sense of what words were going to go with what music?
He did. I had no idea. I knew kind of that on "Steal Softly Through Snow," because he had written the lyrics ahead of time, and he used to have Jeff Cotton, you know, write everything in long, and he would print on like typing paper whatever Don would dictate to him. And,
Right.
I mean, sometimes they'd be up all night doing that. And I think, well, he's not going to be any good today, so I guess I'll work with Mark and Bill. You know? But yeah, reams of stuff, you know. But yeah, I think on "Steal Softly," you know, he was in the other room doing lyrics or thinking about what he wanted to do. You're saying, how did we memorize all that stuff? I don't know. You know, I think, you know, it just, when you're so absorbed in it and you're not going anywhere and you don't have a sex life or a social life, you're not eating, you got to do something with your time.
Right, right.
So
Yeah.
that was it. You know,
Yeah.
that was what we did. It got to the point, Samuel, to where I remember a lot of times I used to sit at my drums because it was sort of like my desk. You know, I would put notebooks on my floor tom, and I'd put music that I was retranscribing on the suspended tom, and then I'd sit on the snare and write, because you couldn't do it at the piano, and the dining room table didn't have any chairs.
Right.
So that's where I would work. And I remember the guys standing in the room with their backs to me, standing in opposite corners of the room, working on different songs. You know, while I was doing that, writing out, retranscribing stuff, you know, to organize it better. And I stopped Jeff one day and said, "You're playing the wrong note." That's how nuts we were.
That's unbelievable.
And he said, "No." I said, "What are you playing?" "It's this." And so I got the music out and took it over and played it for him. And it was half step off. One of the notes was half step off. And he looked at me like, "How did you know that?"
That's amazing.
Because I'm crazy like you are. Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, it was, you know, I don't think too many musicians have ever had an experience like that.
No, it really strikes me reading about it that the process really is absolutely unique. And one of the reasons I think there's never going to be another Trout Mask Replica or anything closely resembling it, just because you're never going to get, you know, you're never going to get five guys willing to live in a house together for a year under those kinds of circumstances, learning that kind of music. I mean, people don't work that way typically. I mean, it's a...
Yeah, I was kind of making a joke to Eric Clerks, the president guitarist in the Magic Band, who is a highly schooled, wonderful guy and great musician. I was talking to him on the phone, and I said, you know, I'm going to do a farewell tour at the Magic Band, and we were discussing it. And I said, you know, I may put my own group together from locals, right, you know, around here. You know, maybe not schooled guys, but just guys that want to really play some hard stuff. And I was thinking that I could, you know, rent a house and get them all in there. And I kept going on. I was describing the Trout Mask, you know, situation to him. just to see how long it would take him to catch on that I was joking. And suddenly he started laughing. But I have thought that I would like to find some younger players, and I don't know. People say I'm hard to get along with. I don't know. I can't tell. I try to be nice to people, but if they aren't playing something right, or I don't think they're living up to their end of the bargain, I will confront them.
Right. Right.
And not in an unkind way or yelling, and I usually will do it privately, but I really believe that you could get people to do that kind of stuff with kindness rather than with terror,
Yeah, it strikes me that it's so far outside of the realm of what normally goes on in a rock or a pop setting. I mean, it's basically it's going into the territory of avant-garde composition, and that's something that for sure. And it's not something that a lot of people who are playing blues-based music are going to be able to deal with. So
right.
So obviously it took an unusual working situation in order to make that happen, but you can certainly understand why a lot of people wouldn't agree to work that way.
Yeah.
So okay, so Don would write the words first, and then presumably he would have them in mind when he was writing a particular piece.
I really don't know. I can't say for sure, because he did a lot. He would do stuff. Yeah, sometimes he did, but I can't say that he did that every time. He didn't have like a standard process that he used like that, except that he would sit out at the piano, and usually it would take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours for him to go through all the parts that he wanted in a particular piece.
Oh, I thought it was 8.5 hours for the whole record.
No, he mistook that for a Fellini movie.
No, but there are. So I think there are pieces on Trout Mask where the vocal part is fairly melodic, and you can see how it relates to the instrumental parts.
Like Ella Guru.
Yeah, for example, yeah.
Okay.
And there's other pieces where it's almost half sung, half spoken, right? So it's not
right.
There's not that necessarily that tight connection between what the voice is doing and what the instruments are doing. But then there's a piece like Hobo Chang Ba where there's elements on that okay, so he's doing a kind of very un-PC kind of vocalization on that piece, right? And you have these open sort of parallel fifths on the guitar that towards the end of the piece, dum bum bum da da dum da da, that seem to relate to that kind of pentatonic idea. So
sure.
Yeah, so I mean that I can see as relating to the lyrical idea, but in other pieces it's not always particularly obvious. Bill's Corpse, for example, it's you also have a part of the poem that I believe it's on that one where the text goes beyond the end of the music, and he's actually saying a few words at the end that after the instruments have actually stopped playing.
Oh yeah, yeah, I remember that. I don't know how I'm going to get that in there.
Yeah.
Well, I never rehearsed with a band. So, that was, now she knows she's a floozy, or now I know she's a floozy, or something like that.
Right, yeah. So he didn't always have a clear idea, necessarily, of how the words and the music were going to go together.
Right.
Yeah. So
I had no idea how it was going to go together. And he used to say, "You think you got a hard job, man? I got to sing to that shit." That's what he said to me one night.
Well, that puts things into perspective.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the evolution of your drum style, because the drumming on Trout Mask Replica is really unlike anything. And one of the things that really strikes me about it is the rhythmic independence of it. I mean, it's so you're often doing multiple rhythms simultaneously. So that's one thing. And then one thing that always struck me, especially when I first heard the record, was how varied your use of the hi-hat is, right? That you use an extraordinary range of different hi-hat techniques on the album, and not all that much in the way of conventional cymbal playing. So, first of all, does that perception ring true for you? And
sure.
yeah. And how did that come about?
Well, when I first joined the band, way back when, the first practice I went to, Alex Snuffer was in the band. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but for a while he was the drummer and they had a different guy playing guitar. So Alex had developed certain ideas about the drums and especially Delta blues kind of stuff. And I think he picked that up from, the Rising Suns drummer. I can't think of his name. Jesse Ed Davis. I'm bad with names, but I think it was Jesse Ed Davis. He'd picked up a few Delta rhythms, and one of them was, okay.
Uh-huh.
And so Alex taught me that rhythm, and I thought, well, that's an interesting use of the hi-hat opening and closing a different way. And so that was sort of the beginning of the idea that got me thinking about the hi-hat as more of an expressive part of the kit than I had thought about it before. Because with me, it was mostly, for that. So that got me started. And then when I started working, I would work on some of their old stuff that I thought they were going to do again when I was alone. Like, for instance, there was a song called Obi Man. And Alex had played drums on it, and I never cared for the drum part that he did, although his timing was perfect. But it was like he was playing the same thing with both hands. And I thought that would be better if it was like boom chakum boom boom bop bop boom chakum boom bop bop, that kind of a feel.
Mm-hmm.
So that got me thinking about it, and I thought, well, I could put a little doom taku doom da da shum tatu doom da da shum tatu, So that's where he sort of got the idea of it. And then when we were living in the house just before the Trout Mask house, we lived in a house just down the street from where we did that. It was a little cottage, and I couldn't really set up my drums. Don was paranoid about the police showing up. He'd been arrested, and he was scared to death of the police. And so all I could do was sit on the floor with a snare drum with rags in it and beat on that and kind of keep my hands in shape a little bit. I couldn't set up a kit, and practice independence. But I'd do that, and I'd also pound on my knees, and use my feet, sort of air drumming,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, just to keep my limbs coordinated a little bit. But I couldn't really play the set. And then while I was doing that, I was writing out these patterns. I told you I'd been writing out drum patterns.
Right.
And I would just sit down and write out random patterns like da 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 da, that kind of thing, just on. And then I'd try reading them back. And I was never a good sight reader. I'm dyslexic or something. But because of that, one day I just saw this vision of myself playing in a sort of ambidextrous polyrhythmic style. I just saw myself doing it in my head.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to explain how you can have a vision like that, except to say that I saw myself doing it in my head. And I did. I mean, it was like I was outside my body watching me play like that.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that would be interesting to do.
Well,
so that's how I started writing.
So if I can just briefly talk about my own experience, because I'm a composer.
Sure.
And I work with performers on a regular basis. And one thing I've noticed is occasionally I'll run into a performer that has a way of playing that's so unique, and they just have physical abilities that other people don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of these people as almost like physical mutants. Like they just have some kind of motor control that's just not. It's beyond what normal people can do.
Right.
And I think that there's a physiological aspect to it. I mean, if you're intrinsically drawn to these kinds of complex patterns, and this kind of limb independence that you also talk about, then it's something that is located in the body somehow, right? And it must be kind of an innate thing that appeals to you, or that you have the capacity to do, because not everybody can play that way, obviously.
You're saying that my physiology is different, and I was drawn to it because of that?
You must have had some kind of motor ability or sensitivity, or I don't know. There's a level of rhythmic sophistication that's way beyond what you normally get. So,
I think it's because my brain didn't get oxygen for the first 5 minutes after I was born. I don't know. Yeah, I always was drawn to weird. I was always drawn to things that were unexplained, that couldn't be explained. And I always, whenever somebody said that's impossible, I wanted to prove them wrong.
Right.
That was part of my thing. I really felt like people could do things that they didn't believe they could do. Yeah. Now, I didn't want to put that in the physical realm.
Yeah.
I'm talking like the physical realm in terms of like athletics. I went into gymnastics for a while and landed on my head while I was trying to do a backflip, and I thought, that's it. I'm not going to get paralyzed trying to show off for girls. So I thought that's when I really switched over into music almost immediately.
Yeah.
I thought that this is the thing where I can do something that I enjoy, and I don't have to risk life and limb to do it.
Right. Because I've noticed that people who have this kind of capacity, they have to do it, right? Otherwise, it eats at you. I don't know if that's what your experience is like, but it's as though you have this extraordinary capacity, obviously, and you need to exercise it. You need to bring it out, because and that involves setting challenges for yourself and always sort of pushing the boundaries of what you're able to do.
Mm-hmm. I just did that with there's one particular sax solo that John Coltrane did on a song called Afro Blue.
Uh-huh.
And I have listened to that probably 10,000 times.
Huh.
I've just listened to it over and over because every line in that, almost every line, is a perfect composition. If you listen to it, it's just like from beginning to end, it just works.
Yeah.
And I've heard him sometimes when I went, oh, that's crap. But this particular one really got to me. So I actually transcribed it out, and I thought, I'm going to learn how to play this. And the key that it was in was really difficult for me on sax, because I play a little soprano now and then.
Yeah.
So I put it away and thought, I'm probably not going to bother learning that. What's the use? I'm never going to play it anyway. And then I had the band learn Ant-Man B. And rather than do the kind of noise sax kind of thing that Don did on Ant-Man B, I thought, I wonder if I could superimpose that Coltrane solo over the top of this, because it's in 3/4 time, but Ant-Man B is in 4/4. And I thought, I wonder if I could superimpose that and change the key, if it would work. And when I first started, it was like, I spent 2 days trying to get one measure right, one phrase right,
Right.
And then it got better and better, and finally I was able to play it from beginning to end. I never have done so successfully on stage. I've always gotten lost somewhere. But just I was driven,
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was quite the learning curve for me, but it was the same kind of thing as that I was driven to do on the drums after I had that vision. Something that pulls you towards it.
Right.
If you have something pulling you, it's better than if you're trying to drive yourself.
Yeah.
If you have something pulling you, you don't even think about the effort because you're going towards something.
Right.
And that's what always motivated me with anything.
Right. So you had a vision of what it was that you wanted to accomplish,
right.
And then and it pulled you forward.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Ant-Man B. Now, one thing that you that you describe a few times in the book, and it comes up also on your solo record, also O Solo Drumbo, is this? I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but PK. How do you say it?
Picaro P.
Picaro P. So Can you describe that rhythm? Maybe describe it vocally and explain what it is about that, because it comes up a fair bit.
It's a funny story behind that, because I had my drum set in the living room, of course, and I was outside, and Don was playing my drums, which is probably why I was outside. Now that I think about it, he was playing my drums, and all of a sudden I hear him going, "John, John," and I came in. He goes, "Write this down, man." He was sitting on the drums in his pajamas, and he had this black robe with red piping. It was sort of Oriental looking that his mother had given him. And he had that on, and he's sitting he used to wear that sometimes for days, Anyway, he said, "Can you get this? Can you get this, man?" And it was a fairly simple rhythm to play, but I said, "Sure, write it down, man." So I got the book, and so what do you call it? Picaro P. I didn't ask him why, so I put Picaro P, and I wrote the rhythm down, and it was, I'd been transcribing his stuff for so long that I was so used to writing his rhythms that I jotted it down like I had it done in 30 seconds easily.
Right.
It's a little harder with drums because you got 4 things instead of just hands. You got 4 appendages there, so I wanted to make sure it was right. But I got it in about 30 seconds. But I was sort of all the crap that he put everybody through. He kept saying, "Do you have it yet?" I'm standing there pretending like I'm still writing. I'm going, "No, you got to keep playing it. I don't know how much longer I can play this, man."
So you got your revenge.
I think I kept him playing it nearly 5 minutes before I finally, thought, "Oh, I'm being really sadistic here."
Right.
But that was kind of one of those impish moments that you never, I never told him that story.
Right, that's probably a good thing.
But the beat itself is da 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 da. That's all the things in it, but it's done with the hands and the feet.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know if I could do it on the drum set easier or what. My room's a mess, so I don't even know if I can sit this anywhere. Okay, so it was like. So the hands are going. And the feet are going.
Right.
Let's see. Yeah. So it's a very simple pattern, but isn't that catchy?
That's a wonderful rhythm. Yeah. And
it's sort of it's kind of a shuffle.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a straight time thing.
Yeah.
Artie Tripp used to play like real straight.
Huh.
And I said, "No, man, you got to swing
Right.
it."
Right.
Swing it.
So you're playing.
Now, I'm not putting Artie down because Artie taught me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a lot of technique stuff because he was a schooled player, a great player.
Well, on Dr. Dark, where you're both playing simultaneously, it's very clear that you have very different styles. It's very easy to tell who's playing what on that. On that particular piece. But so just on that excerpt you just played on the cymbals, you're playing on the bells, right? Of the cymbals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both bells. Okay.
So
And that's where it gets Picaro P. Picaro P. Picaro P. Picaro P. In fact, he wrote a song called Picaro Pete, which was, I think it was an outtake on The Spotlight Kid. He did a lot of material back there, and then he'd never finish. I mean, there was dozens of unfinished things on that album.
Yeah. So, did he understand the complexity of what he was writing? Did he know what a polyrhythm was? Did he understand about having different overlapping time signatures and things like this?
No, he didn't have a clue. Sometimes I wondered, when I write something down that he's play, I wondered if he knew that it was in a different time signature, you know. But he didn't know what a time signature was. No, he didn't know where middle C on the piano was. Everything came from here, and he, you know, or he would search. Sometimes he'd just search, but sometimes he had a specific thing in his head. He did have different ways of being motivated. Sometimes he was ambling around, you know, for a half an hour before he'd actually go, oh, get this, you know, and he'd play something. And they were usually 1 and 2 bar phrases, you know, because he really couldn't play much of anything past that and repeat it. And I needed it more than once. So I got to where I'd sit on the end of the piano next to him and I'd play it a couple octaves up. And sometimes he'd be struggling to find something, and I'd see what finger position he was using, and I'd say, wait, is this it? And I'd play it, and he'd go, that's it!
Okay, so we were talking about the different overlapping time signatures, and you were saying that Don really had no idea about he had no notion of that at all.
No, because the reason I knew that is because sometimes he'd say, okay, now when he does that, you do this. And I said, that's going to be hard to do unless he counts it.
Right.
He'd say, man, you don't need to count that, just do it, you know. And I'd say, no, because he's playing in a different time signature. He's playing, you know, so he's not going to be able to listen to what the other guy's doing and do what he's doing.
Right.
You know, he can't do that. It's impossible. It's not impossible if he counts it, though. So I'd have the one guy play, and I'd say, you point to him when you want him to come in, okay? And so, you know, maybe Jeff would be playing a riff, you know, and he'd go, there! So I'd count the number of measures, and then I'd figure out Bill's part, you know, and how far it went. I'd say, okay, try doing that 3.5 measures and then coming in, or whatever. And it usually worked. And you know, the guys would kind of look at me like, how'd you do that, you know? And it was just basically just common denominators, you know.
Yeah.
If you got a guy playing in 3 and you got a guy playing in 4, every 12 beats, they hit, I used to call it a touch point.
Right.
They're starting the measure together again.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So you know, that's how I built the whole album. I just used the same system because I didn't want to get any more complicated than it already was.
Yeah. I mean, I find this really interesting, just technically, just understanding how this process worked, because some of the pieces you can understand that there is a common pulse between the different parts, and you can relate things to that. But on some of them, it really sounds like it's two different tempi. Like, there's no common pulse at all between the different parts. Like on Frownland.
Like on the beginning of I'm sorry, you were saying Frownland.
Yeah, but maybe you had something else in mind.
Well, you know, I was thinking Hair Pie at the very beginning. You know, you got one guitar playing da 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 da, and the other guy's going da 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 da. Well, he's playing da 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 da, sort of loosely over the top of this. So you've got 3/4, you know.
Right.
Da 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 da, whatever that is. So it was sort of an instinctual thing, and you know, mostly I let the guys figure that out on their own, so they'd have their own way of doing it. Because the guys had to come in after that together on that da 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 da, you know. So they had to work that out on their own, but you know, I just told Bill, I said, it's a part that floats over the other part.
Uh-huh.
You know, and he got it from that and figured out what we were talking about. You know?
Okay. It's
yeah. There's like the other one, Hobo Changba is one. You know, I'm trying to think of the way that starts out.
It starts with a little guitar solo, which is impossible to sing, and then there's a
do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a part in there where everybody stops and goes ba da ba 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 ba.
Right.
Whole different time signature, you know, whole different tempo.
Yeah.
that song just, that kills me. I'd love to do that one live because it's just such a great piece.
So that's my other question. So okay, so I can understand how you would have these different time signatures overlapping and even different pulses going on at the same time. But when the band would suddenly leap into a new tempo altogether and somehow find a new pulse, that blows my mind, because I usually work with conductors. I write a lot of chamber music and orchestral music and things like this, and I like to do a lot of complex rhythmic stuff. But obviously with a conductor, you can manage, because they can always show you what the upbeat is before you have the downbeat. You can sort of have some preparation before you get into the new tempo, and he can sort of lead everybody. But if you don't have a conductor and it's five guys who don't have anything to, I suppose you have eye contact and things like that, but how do you find the new tempo, especially when there's no common pulse between tempo 1 and tempo 2?
It's just playing together a lot. We would play through each, we would play up to that point, and then we would start the new section. We'd stop for a minute and start the new section, and we'd memorize the tempo till it felt good. And we just do that over and over, and then we say, let's try it together now. That's how it happened. And those guys, Bill and Mark and Jeff, they were constantly practicing together.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark, they both had sort of acoustic. I think they were both hollow body guitars, so they could kind of hear themselves.
Uh-huh.
And Mark would stick his bass up against, the neck of the bass up against the wall, and it would resonate enough to where he could hear it.
Huh, amazing.
And they would stand in a circle with each other. Those guys were such a team. It was amazing. It was amazing to watch those guys.
Yeah. No, because you don't normally, again, get that level of intensity, and the number of hours they must have put in working together is really, really unusual. So, and you can hear it on the record. There's an incredible symbiosis. There's an incredible synthesis of everyone playing together. That's one of the things that makes the album so extraordinary, I think.
Yeah.
So how did you feel about the mix when you finally heard it? Because I'm not clear on whether the band was involved with that at all. If Zappa just went and did it all by himself, or
we weren't really involved with it. I found mixing sessions to be boring.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't stand mixing sessions. The main thing I was disappointed with when I heard it was that it seemed like the band was just buried with vocal, with horn. Anything Don was really loud.
Yeah.
So, and I thought, man, there's a lot of stuff going on there that people are never going to get to really hear.
Yeah.
Which is why when I formed the Magic Band, we did some of those things instrumentally.
Yeah.
Like Steal Softly and Hair Pie and
right.
My Human Gets Me Blues.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a revelation actually to hear the I've got the live disc that's from, I believe it was from 2004, 21st Century Mirror Man, and that's a revelation to listen to, because you can really hear everything. And of course also the Grow Finn set, the original house sessions of Trout Mask Replica are extremely interesting. Also,
do you have the let me get it here. Do you have this one?
No, I don't have that one.
That's probably the best example. This is the Magic Band plays the music of Captain Beefheart. I don't know where we came up with that title, but anyway, no, the record company wanted to be that title so that they could, it had the name Captain Beefheart in there.
Right.
Because it sells more.
Yeah.
More hits on the internet, kids. So anyway, this is a very, very good CD.
Okay.
I'll brag and say I mixed it myself. But the thing is, I know this music as well as anybody probably, and I think that these mixes are probably the most accurate, well-balanced, where you can actually hear everything most of the time.
So when you do these live recreations of the pieces, do you have charts you're working from? How does that work exactly?
Well, the original guys didn't read. I'm talking Denny, Gary, Mark. None of them read. So basically what I did for the tough pieces like Human Gets Me Blues, Hair Pie, and Steal Softly Through Snow. Those were the three that I picked because those are my favorite ones. And I thought they were the easiest to hear the parts on too. And I thought that the band could play those because there's not a lot of weird tempo changes and stuff. Plus, I love the drum parts.
Right.
So there was a bias there too.
Right, of course.
But anyway, I made MIDI sequences, and then I sent them each their part separately, and then I sent them the other parts without their parts, so they could. Actually, there were three. There was a full one with everything. Then there was one of just their separated track. Then there was one of the other parts without their part, so they could practice along with that.
Yeah.
So that helped. Some of it was inaccurate, in the beginning, but I felt like as long as it had a flow to it and carried the general impression, it's sort of like an impressionistic painting. If you can tell that it's a building, you've done your job. And that's kind of the way I had to go about that, because I didn't want to get in all the nitpicky little particular notes. I mean, there's parts on there that were never played correctly, but this album seems to have the closest to that.
Yeah, because some of the parts, as I discovered when I attempted to transcribe Frownland, some of them are actually quite hard to hear.
Yeah.
So you did actually write everything out at the time. So I was curious, what happened to the transcriptions? Are there copies of those anywhere?
I did write out everything at the time of the Magic Band reunion.
No, I mean in '69.
Oh, in '69, yeah. All those went with Don.
So he kept everything that you wrote out.
Right.
And there were no copies.
No.
Huh.
The originals were done with pencil, just a manuscript book. And after a while, when people were coming back and saying, "Hey, John, I forgot the third part to Hair Pie," I was going, "Oh, where in the hell is that?"
Yeah.
Because they were sort of scattered, because I rearranged the parts.
Yeah.
I didn't give them to them in the same. I'd say, "Wait a minute, this works better with that." So I rearranged stuff, and it's sort of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Don dumped the thing on the table, and then you had to put together to make a picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I realized that, oh man, I'm going to have to get more organized. So I got some really good clear white manuscript paper, just notebook size, 3-ring binder stuff, but white. Instead of that brown stuff, and I got a good ink pen, and I actually did them all in ink. It wasn't like a calligraphy pen or anything. It was just a little ink pen, but I did them all so they'd be exact. And Don says, "What the hell are you rewriting all this stuff for?" And I said, "Because someday, Don, you may have a different person wanting to play it, and then you've got it, and all you have to do is hand them this, and they'll know what to do."
Right.
And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. And then in 1975, we were going to do this tour, and we couldn't find a bass player because nobody can play like Mark,
Yeah.
And Elliot Ingber was in the band at the time. It was Wing Deal Fingerling in the band. That was his stage name.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "I know this guy who might be able to do it. His name's Buell Neidlinger." And I thought, what a weird name. So anyway, I said, well, let's see if we can get him over here. So he called him, and Buell came right over, and he looked like an Eastern mystic. He was wearing all white Madras Indian kind of, drawstring pants and, his pullover shirt, a very, you wanted to sit down lotus position with him and ask him his wisdom, for your life. Anyway, he pulled out his bass. I mean, I think it was a Fender jazz bass, if I remember. And I said, well, I'd like to try this thing called My Human Gets Me Blues. And he said, okay. Now, it was written in treble clef, because I didn't know about bass clef, It was written in treble clef. I explained to him how many times, in fact, I think I wrote it down, pencil, 3 times this, I'll give you the cue when we go from here to here. Now, you've heard the song. It goes into that weird 3/4 time carousel, crazy carousel thing in the middle.
Yeah.
He nailed it the first time. I mean, we hadn't played anything but that, and he nailed it the first time he played it.
Wow. That's amazing.
Okay, so there, yeah. I tried to get him for the reunion, but, he didn't want to do it.
So theoretically, these sort of charts, these still exist somewhere on the planet, right? I mean,
I don't know. They could be thrown away for all I know.
It's amazing. The thing that strikes me is that when a composer dies, their slightest thing will be carefully taken up usually by a university or something, and cataloged and transcribed and put in an air-controlled vault somewhere in Switzerland, and this music is so important. This Trout Mask Replica, and every Beefheart record, and just the casualness with which some of the original documents are treated is kind of amazing. It would be fascinating to see these things.
Kind of criminal.
Well, it is. It is.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's really a shame, and it's a shame that they didn't approve of me. Starting the Magic Band up. In fact, I just got a letter. They told me to stop.
Wait, they being the Don Van Vliet estate?
Yeah, it was the representative of the Van Vliet estate, which is Jan. I mean, who else could it be? It's Jan. So he's telling me that I do not have the approval of the Van Vliet estate to continue, and I must stop. And I'm thinking, I was so much an integral part of that happening.
Yeah.
I helped them move when they were stuck in Northern California, and everything went south for them. I helped them to move south.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I was friends with him. I bailed him out a few times. I was there when he needed somebody, and and the thing is that everything has been credited. If you look at the inside of this album, it's got all the titles, but the inside has all the publishing credits. I looked him up on all the albums, because he had about 4 or 5 publishing companies. I know he had God's Golf Ball and whatever, and on and on. So it was very disappointing for me to read that. But then again, I thought I must be doing something. As long as I have their disapproval, I know I must be doing the right thing.
Right.
So a lot of this stuff I've especially with the latest band, because they read, I've gone back through and really spent hours and hours, sometimes looping one measure music to get every note right. And then listening to it again and again. It about drove myself crazy, but I've got a lot of this stuff archived, and I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with it yet, but I'll do, it'll get out there some way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're doing an extraordinary service for the music, and it's obviously taking a great deal of your time to do this, and you've been doing it for a number of years now. So I mean, I think you're doing a very generous act with regards to people who like this music, because it needs to be...
Well, I can't help myself.
Yeah, well...
That's the best thing I can say.
Yeah. So what happened to the original multi-track masters of Trout Mask? Do those exist somewhere?
Zappa
they've got them.
Vault.
Yeah.
I don't know where they are now, but the Zappa Vault has them. God knows what they'll do with them.
Yeah.
I would love to have a digitized version of that entire album and remix it properly.
Yeah. No
because it could really be. Plus, you could archive each song. It would be wonderful to have that. It would really be marvelous. I wish somebody, one of these rich fans could buy that.
Yeah.
Just the original master, have it digitized, and just keep the original, but give me a digitized version of it so that I could mix it the way it properly needs to be mixed.
Just take the voice down a hair on Dachau Blues, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, The one thing that's really bad is the separation on the drums is horrible because they actually put a wedge monitor in the drum booth.
A wedge monitor. Can you
In
explain
the
what that
drum
is?
booth.
Yeah.
A wedge monitor is just, it's just a monitor like if a singer, he has a monitor on stage that's kind of slanted,
Oh, okay.
at an angle.
Okay.
A wedge monitor. They had one of those in the booth.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't keep headphones on because I told you that I had to sort of modify my style of playing because of playing on cardboard. So I was like really stiff and jerky when I played, and the headphones, I swear, would fly off and fly 10 feet away. They wouldn't even stay on my head because I moved so sporadically, So they had to, that's the only way I could hear the band.
I see. Okay. So there'd be leakage all over the drum parts then.
Oh, yeah. Terrible
Yeah.
leakage.
Yeah.
And it'd be wonderful to be able to redo the drums,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so was anything actually left off the album? Because you mentioned that there were just piles and piles of material being generated at the time. Don was constantly writing. Were there any
piles and piles of lyrics and poetry and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
But not, and some of it was used later. I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but there was a poem that he read on batching puller. My eyes are burnt and bleeding and all that, blah, blah, blah. Poo Patch, 81 Poo Patch, or something like that.
Okay.
I never did get it. Don't ask me what it's about. Where the light shows in and the light shows out. Anyway, a lot of stuff used later. Like, for instance, the Floppy Boot Stomp lyrics were written in that environment.
I see. Okay. So there were things that came out later on. Yeah.
Yeah. Not music, though. There was, interestingly enough, and the first time we went in the studio, and you were asking about transition songs.
Yeah.
But they need transition songs from Strictly Personal to Trout Mask, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there were. Veterans Day Poppy, Moonlight in Vermont, and Sugar and Spikes.
Uh-huh.
Okay, those were all written after Trout Mask was recorded. I mean, after Strictly Personal was recorded. Those three songs were written in the interim between that time and the time we moved to the Trout Mask house before Don got the piano.
I see.
So Veterans Day Poppy, Moonlight on Vermont, and Sugar and Spikes.
Yeah. And Gary Marker played on those, is that right?
He played on two of them.
Uh-huh.
Sugar and Spikes actually was done, and there were two sessions. Our first session with Zappa was in Sunset Sound Studios, and that was in Hollywood, a very popular studio, a very expensive studio.
Mm-hmm.
And he took us in one night, and I think we were there about 6 hours, maybe 4 to 6 hours. But Bill Harkerode insists that we did another version of Candy Corn.
Huh.
Because the plan, which I didn't know about, but the plan was to re-record the entire Strictly Personal album. I don't know why.
So wait, a third time?
Yeah, because it was recorded originally with Buddha, and a few songs were added, and then it was recorded as Strictly Personal.
Right.
And then they were going to do it again because Don didn't like that psychedelic bromo seltzer, as he called it. The phase shifting.
Yeah. So they were going to do that again. I see.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, we did that there, and the rest of it was done at the studio in Glendale. I name it in the book. For some reason today I can't think of the name.
Is it Whitney?
Whitney Studios in Glendale.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's quite interesting. So, so I also was wondering how specific were Don's instructions in terms of how the different fragments of music would line up together, or in what order they would appear, because I've often heard it said, like with regards to Trout Mask, that there's no repetition or that the songs are structured in a very strange way. But actually, when I listened very closely to Frownland, it immediately became obvious that it's full of repetition, for one thing. Lots of things are repeated. And not only that, but there are licks that come back later on in the song. So there's a very clear structure to it in that sense. Right? So
well, I actually think that the guys, because what I did with Frownland, everything else I said, okay, you play this X amount of times and there's a break here or whatever. But on Frownland, I just said, have at it.
Uh-huh.
After that first da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da,
yeah.
I just said, have at it, guys, do whatever. Just make it your own.
Uh-huh.
And I think they actually decided to do that, because it's sort of, when I listen to it, it's always to me like a bunch of snakes flying through the air together. They're sort of all flying and they're all together, but they're not really touching each other. They're all independent of each other, but they're all flying through the air together, and they stop at the same time and they start at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I always see in my head when I hear that song.
Yeah, they have a floating relationship to each other. It's not really...
They do, yeah.
Yeah. So I was also wondering, just why did the band not perform during the entire Trout Mask period?
Don didn't want to perform. He never wanted to perform.
Really?
And that's the only way we could have made some, I would have loved to perform just to get out of that house.
Yeah.
But for another reason, to make some money.
Yeah.
Because basically, Bill Harkerode's mom and Don's mom were supporting the band. They were paying the bills and buying the food and so on.
So he didn't want you to play. That's extraordinary. So
he didn't want to perform. No, he hated going out and performing.
I see. Okay, interesting. Yeah, because it always struck me as strange, given the enormous amount of work involved in making the record and the extended period of time. I understand you only did one concert with the Trout Mask group.
Yeah, it was a free concert. I think it was a cancer, like a donation kind of thing, benefit, a cancer benefit. Yeah. And it was at the same theater, the Aquarius Theater.
Yeah.
Where Hair was, was performed.
Yeah.
And Frank Zappa was there that night. I can't remember who else. I think Buddy Miles played just before us, and then we went on and did a set.
Mm-hmm.
And Don had his cousin in the band. His cousin didn't know anything about playing an instrument. He could barely make sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he was playing the bass clarinet, on stage with us, and dressed in the same thing he was wearing on the back cover or on the middle cover.
You're being incredibly patient with my detailed questions, so
I'm trying, Sam.
So I just have a couple more to throw at you.
Sure.
If I can test you a tiny little bit more. So, okay, one thing that you've written that really struck me was you said, I'm quoting you, "I certainly don't consider myself any kind of a great drummer from the standpoint of technique." So I was actually extremely shocked when I read that, because your drum parts are unbelievably complex and sophisticated, and there's all these polyrhythms going on, and you've got really your own style happening. So what would it take for you to consider yourself a great drummer? I don't understand.
Well, when I think of a great drummer, I think of somebody like Buddy Rich or Dave Weckl or Steve Gadd, guys like this. I wasn't ever a big Neil Peart fan, although a lot of people think he's high up the ladder, but I was more jazz oriented. But technique, speed, the ability to improvise over a riff, or I always wanted to do that, and I never really had the opportunity to do it. Later in life, I played in a jazz group for a while. In my late 30s, I played in a jazz group for mid to late 30s for about 7 years. And that's probably the best I was, as a drummer, but I still felt like I lacked that accuracy that I hear when I listen to these guys. So in that sense, no, I don't consider, I'm not trying to be, false modesty or anything. Yeah. I'm just saying these guys have technique and they have chops that, I'll never have. But at the same time, I bet if I gave any of them hair pie and told them to play it, they'd have just as hard a time learning it as I did.
Yeah.
Because it's a very unique. It's like, what were you thinking when you wrote this? And I was surprised that our latest drummer, Andy, who is a great guy, a fantastic drummer too. He's got all that stuff that I was talking about. He's got the control and the speed, and he's incredible foot action. He played metal for a while, I think, and that's where he got the double kick stuff. But he's just an incredible drummer. So I gave him hair pie, and his remark in an interview was, and I saw these parts to hair pie, and I went, what the fuck did I get myself into? and I was talking to him about the black page one day, and he said, listen, the black page is easy compared to hair pie. So I felt pretty good then. I thought, well, that's kind of a feather in my cap, and I was happy about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because you really have to be able to feel these complex polyrhythms physically in the body, right, in order to be able to play them.
Yeah.
And that probably takes a very special type of performer.
I had Cliff Martinez, who was the last Beefheart drummer. He played on Ice Cream for Crow. He called me, and he talked to me on the phone a few times, but he called me and he says, I just got in the band. And he said, can you give me some lessons? And I charged him some outrageous amount of money, because I didn't want to do it. I really didn't want to do it. But I charged him some outrageous, and he says, okay. I'm going, crap. So I had him come. He came up about 4 times, I think. And I taught him the parts to hair pie, because I thought if he can play that, he can probably play anything else. Yeah. And that'll influence him playing enough to where the stuff that he comes up with for the album will be right.
Right.
Now, the first thing I noticed, he had memorized all the parts, but when he came up and played them, it was like a freaking robot, It was like really stiff, and I said, Cliff, I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. I said, you've got to relax, man. You can't play this stuff and be that tight, So he loosened up, and I think it helped him, but he was scared. I think he was very scared when he joined that band.
Yeah.
And Don's idea of writing a drum part was he gave Cliff a tape. He said, here's the drum part to this song, man. So Cliff takes it home, and it's he said, all I could hear was it sounded like somebody washing dishes and water running, and there was a TV on in the background. And so Cliff said, I spent all night with this, trying. He said, so I started listening, and I could hear these little rhythms here and there. So I transcribed out this thing and memorized it, and I went in and played it the next day. And Don says, man, that's exactly what I wanted. I mean, that's the way Don composed the drum part. I don't think so. But here's the funny punchline. Jeff Tepper, Morris Tepper, was in the band at the time, and he goes, yeah, but I don't hear the water thing, Don. So Cliff says, I wanted to kill him. Up all night listening to running water and washing dishes, trying to make a drum part. He says, I don't hear the water thing, Don.
Amazing. Yeah. No, I mean, if you want to do something really different, you have to have different methods, and that's obvious that he had very different methods. And one of the things that strikes me listening to these records is it's like there's a systematic avoidance of anything obvious, right? It's like he went through it sort of level by level and said, anything that could be normal or ordinary in terms of the way you would approach something like this is just out the window. On every, for example, the cardboard on the drums. I mean, so how did it happen that you were playing this way in rehearsal, and then just in order to mute them, basically, right, in order to not disturb the neighbors, and then it ended up being like that on the record?
Well, he just asked me to do that for one song. It was Hair Pie.
Uh-huh.
The studio version of Hair Pie, which I think was Hair Pie Baked 2, if I remember. He just asked me to do that on the one song.
I see. Okay.
He says, "Hey, man," he stopped and he comes walking out. He comes over to me and he says, "Put the cardboard on the drums, man." So, I had the cardboard there for some reason. I don't know why, but so I put it on the drums for that one piece.
Okay, I see.
But that wasn't everything,
Yeah.
Frank says, Drumbo had a real problem because Don made him put cardboard. Everything was covered with cardboard. It wasn't quite that bad.
Yeah. Okay.
But I do think it has a certain quality because you can really hear the parts in that piece. You can really hear the guitar parts and the bass part very clearly.
Uh-huh.
So it did serve a kind of a purpose.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. So, I'll just close with one final thing. So, just for as an anecdote, I think it might be interesting to tell you. When I first actually started studying composition, I was taking lessons with a guy in Toronto by the name of James Blight, and he was a raging Captain Beefheart fan, and I was 17 or 18 years old or something. I was taking my first real composition lessons. And so I had no idea what I was getting into, but he gave me a copy of Lick My Decals Off Baby. And he said, There's a track on there called "The Clouds Are Full of Wine, Not Whiskey or Rye. I want you to transcribe the opening solo, in music notation." So that was my initiation to the world of composition. And man, that was tough. Wasn't easy. I've still got the whole thing memorized. Yeah.
Yeah.
The hardest thing was figuring out the rhythms and what the stresses and how you can sort of put that into rhythmic notation. It wasn't obvious. So.
Yeah.
So.
I kind of did it in a blocked off manner for my first version because that was the first thing I learned how to play on the sax.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Actually, we did an arrangement of that with a riff going underneath it that goes like like a jazz riff. So and the keyboardist is playing like fourths, and I wrote everything out in time over that, and it really turned out nice. It really had a nice phrasing. I broke the phrasing up into sections and put it with that. It's almost like a fusion thing.
Uh-huh.
I've got it somewhere, but I haven't actually. I've got the recording of it, but I haven't actually mixed it yet.
Uh-huh. Well, that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the guys were a little under rehearsed. One of the guys, because it sounds a little off. But.
Uh-huh. Well, listen, John. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
I want to keep talking, man. I want to be in here longer.
It's been a complete delight, and you've got so many fascinating insights into this music. I'm sure. I mean, you and the other guys who played on the record are the only people on the planet who really understand how it was put together and everything that went into it. So I mean, it's incredibly valuable to get your perspective on it. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I probably the good thing about it is see you're a handsome man. So if you were ugly, I would have been out of here an hour ago. At least I didn't have to look at somebody ugly.
Well, I know how the music business works, so that's fine.
There you go. You had a lot of work done, I know.
Yeah.
So it's good, really good to talk to you, and I enjoyed the I don't know what it's called, the thing you did on Frownland.
Yeah.
What is that called?
Analysis.
Analysis. Yeah.
Well, that was actually my job for a number of years. I taught analysis in France at a conservatory in northern France near Lille. And so I was just taking all sorts of different types of music from different periods of music history and pulling them apart and showing the students how they were put together. I just
Do you speak French?
Oh yeah, I'm fluently bilingual.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Well, I'm Canadian, so I actually grew up speaking both French and English.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I moved to France about 15 years ago, so I've been living there for a long time. So.
Oh, you live in France?
Oh, I live there. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I live in Strasbourg in eastern France, right up against the German border. So
Okay.
so the Frownland thing was just an extension of that sort of idea of just, you know, doing music analysis and applying it to something that isn't normally analyzed. So anyway,
Right.
yeah, so that's where that came from. But
All right. Hey, good talking to you.
good talking to you, Don. It was a real pleasure. Thank you again.